Great. Councillor Dunwell, would you like to kick us off today?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kim. Hello, everybody. Thank you. This is our final task force meeting. We're going to be going primarily through discussions and really sort of tying up a few loose ends before we make the final presentation to the council. And I want to, at the beginning and at the end, both say thank you to everyone for all of your time and your active dialogue and participation as we move forward on this. This is important to our city, and everybody's perspective really helps us shape where we're going.
Great. Thank you. And I will echo that as well. I know it's been a handful of meetings, but we're happy to have had you along for the ride. I'm going to turn it over to Beth and Nicole at Echo Northwest. And really our goal today is to talk through the items that were in the handout that we posted a week ago. Primarily focusing on the implementation actions that have been selected and just making sure we've got all the considerations we'd want to have that we can reflect in the document, as well as get feedback on potential anything related to timing, partnerships, monitoring of those actions. So with that, Beth, please take it away.
Certainly. I would like to give an opportunity. I think, Samuel, this might be your first of these meetings. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Well, kind of. I was here for the first couple as a member of the task force representing Fair Housing Council. But yes, at the beginning of February, I joined the DLCD Housing Division, and will be involved in reviewing the housing production strategy that you produce. So congratulations on getting this far, and look forward to seeing the presentation today.
Samuel, this is no wonder that I was so confused. All right. Well, thank you very much. Is there anybody else here who hasn't been here before and would like to introduce themselves? I kind of recognize everybody, which is remarkable. Okay.
Beth,
So
just a second. So have some attendees. So if any attendees, I'll allow you to talk if you want to introduce yourself. So give me just a second. Okay, so Kenny, you're muted.
Oh, okay. I haven't done the no video, but I can speak before.
Yeah. And so just to be clear, I think we just want to identify if anybody is filling in for a task force member. Otherwise, I mean, we can do quick introductions, but I know sometimes we do have alternates filling in. So Kenny, feel free to introduce yourself as an attendee.
Yeah, I'm an attendee. I am an associate planner with Oregon Department of Transportation. And I have attended a couple of these before, so happy to be here again.
Dan, so I'm not rude. Is there anybody else?
I just want to make sure if there's anyone else I'm promoting, if there's anyone else that's an attendee that I haven't promoted that's here as an alternate to a task force member, please raise your hand. But you're also welcome to just listen in. So
I'm not sure if Rachel was here as an alternate.
Yes, Rachel joined us last time.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, sorry. My name's Rachel. I'm with Polish Homes. Anna's been in these meetings previously, but I've kind of taken her role. So I was here for the last one and excited to get going on this one too.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
okay, I think that's everyone, Beth. You can roll now. Thank you.
Okay, and I see that Maria has just joined us as well. So thank you. All right, so I am going to very quickly share my screen and say we will be talking a lot about items that are on this memorandum. I won't be showing it because I'm going to be showing a whiteboard instead. but if anybody wants me to, as we're talking, to go to the memorandum and go to a particular page or anything, you can always tell me to, and I will switch. So does everybody have this memo, or does anybody not have that memo? All right. And then I see that Miranda has joined us as well. So, okay, so our agenda for the afternoon, for our time here, is to review the actions that are proposed at this point to be included in the HPS. And here we are, we're going to our agenda. Discuss the actions and ask you, we'll first start with going through the actions themselves and asking you questions about, are there any implementation considerations that we should have included or and haven't, or things like partnerships or anything like that. We'll discuss the implementation schedule and discuss the monitoring metrics and get any comments that you have. We'll be primarily focusing on the actions that are being considered for including in the HPS specifically. There are a number of actions that are essentially for future housing programs. We can talk about those as much as you'd like within, all right, we can talk about those, but we'll need to limit time on those a little bit so that we're able to talk through any comments on the actions that will specifically be in the HPS. And as a reminder, what the city is required to do with its HPS is it's adopting it, including a timeline of which you see here in this presentation and in the memorandum. And the city will be implementing the actions along that timeline. The city can implement actions before they're due, but if their actions are being implemented later, they'll need to explain some things to do some reporting to DLCD about that. So that's what we're doing. The actions for future considerations are ones that the city could choose to implement either outside of the HPS or substitute into the HPS at its midpoint review, so 3 years in. Or might be something that the city will have set itself up to do a little bit later, so in its next housing production strategy. I don't think we're saying that those actions for future consideration, we're not saying that they're not urgent. We're saying that the city has limited staff capacity and limited financial capacity. But I know there's been a lot of interesting discussions around those. So with that, I would say, let's go ahead and start talking. Are there any questions before we get going? All right, so, and I can only see a few of you. And Nicole is going to scribe for us. So she'll type down the things we're saying in this. So is there any considerations that we should be thinking about related to our first action, which is about looking for land inside of Wilsonville that the city may rezone or redesignate? So it's looking for land that you can upzone. So from a lower zoning code, it's like low density to higher density. Or there may be land that is designated for some other use, like a commercial use or an industrial use or something else that would be better used for housing. So rezoning that. In this, the implementation steps we've got are, of course, the city starting by looking at where there is land that may be appropriate to rezone and developing an analysis about this to determine the potential impacts on availability of employment land or infrastructure that's needed to support housing development. Of course, working with the landowners, the Planning Commission to provide input on potential redesignation or rezoning, and then holding public hearings with the Planning Commission and City Council. So there would be a public process that would be associated with that. The magnitude of impact would really depend on the amount of land that was rezoned. This could be a larger impact. And certainly, I think we've mentioned before that the city had some land that was zoned for industrial that was rezoned to allow residential uses. It's, you know, I never say, Kim, I never say the name of the development, right? The building, right? But it's your TOD site.
Yes, the Wela project. And that actually was not technically a rezoning, but using some provisions of state statute for affordable housing. But similar idea, you know, kind of looking at, are there other pieces of land that, for whatever reason, might make more sense to be residential than industrial or commercial?
Are there any comments on this action?
Does this include within town center?
So town center, by nature of the mixed use zoning that is there, is already, with the exception of some restrictions along I-5, is already planned and zoned to allow housing.
What about the areas that aren't zoned currently for residential?
So it's really, it's just a limitation right along I-5. There were some considerations during that planning process around noise impacts and traffic impacts. So they have the same zoning. It's just a matter of a stipulation in that development code for those particular properties that abut the highway.
So I think what you're saying, Kim, is that town center can already be used for housing for the most part. And where it's not allowed, it may not be appropriate.
Yeah, that was at least the feedback that we got through the planning process.
Are there any other questions or comments on this one?
Yeah, what about areas? So for instance, I'm thinking about the piazza in Villebois. It's already been zoned multifamily housing, but it's been sitting there for a significant number of years, as, you know, not developed. Is it possible to go in and redesignate that from multifamily housing? Because that seems to be the issue and I know that, you know, the property owner is, you know, they're still standing still on it, but is it possible to go in and redesignate that so that becomes more attractive as buildable?
So that particular site does have an approved development on it right now, and that is still an approval that is it has not expired. So I think that could potentially be sticky to change the zoning while there is an active development approval on it. That being said, that is in an area that's guided by a master plan and zoning that does have a broad allowance of uses as well. I think, you know, that's, as we do kind of a scan of what properties under this action we might look at, I think we can take a look at all sites that either might be vacant and or underutilized and see if there are any considerations in the comprehensive plan or in the zoning that supports those comp plan designations to see if there is something that is kind of inhibiting production of housing. And so I think that type of consideration more broadly, I think, is something that we would incorporate into this implementation action.
Well, obviously something's inhibiting the development. So can we count this? I'm really looking at, can we count this in one of these actions as something underway to help us comply with the requirements that we're being asked to fulfill? Even though it's already been, and it may not be number A, but it may be one of the others. If we can't get a developer to develop a spot like that, how can we go and we reevaluate and redesignate and rezone, but yet nothing's getting built on some of the land that's already been zoned and has a plan underneath it for multifamily housing?
a good question, because I think that speaks to, I forget how many meetings ago, but we've had some slides in the past about, what is a local government's role in housing
Yeah.
production.
I know.
And it speaks to an important point. And I think without getting too much into the weeds of the specifics of that particular site, I think what we focus on here in the housing production strategy are really looking at the elements that we have as a local government within our ability to control. And a lot of that is what types of policies we set, what types of zoning we put in place to support the production of housing. Knowing a little bit about that particular site, as well as, a couple other places in the city, one of the issues that has come into play in recent years are market factors.
Yeah.
And in particular, market factors around things like interest rates and how that is impacting the production of multifamily housing in particular more broadly. And I think, that the challenge or the rub here a little bit is that is one of those external factors that is outside of the city's control.
Thank you. Well, very well said, Kim. And so this exercise in the HPS is really more of an exercise.
Mhm.
And I'll echo what Kim just said there. I was thinking that exact thing, Kim, about interest rates and how those have been problematic for building multifamily housing, across the broader region and beyond. I'll also mention that as you're looking at changing zoning, you want to be careful not to down zone. So from high density to low density, unless you've got the landowner's agreement, because that can lead to something like a Measure 49 claim, where the landowner can make a claim that the city is taking away value that they were able to develop before.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions or comments about this one?
Open it up for questions, because I know not everybody in this group works in the world of comp plans and zoning. So I think any feedback about what seems to either make sense or not make sense would be helpful.
So if I were going to put in 2 cents, I like looking at this chart that you have on the screen at the same time as looking at page 14, the implementation schedule, because that kind of maps out the different steps. And so like in 2026, we would evaluate how much land's available, take it to the city council, talk about if we should rezone or redesignate, and then implement it like in 2028 going forward. To me, that really was helpful.
And I will mention, I'll ask Kim if she'll talk about, since we're looking at the schedule for a moment, the way the city is thinking about items A, B, C, and D, implementing them together as part of a broader project that the city is looking at.
Correct. So one of the common threads with all 4 of these action items is that they involve either or both of the city's comprehensive plan and development code. Those are really the documents that guide and govern land use in the city. So that's where a lot of housing policy can be implemented. And one notable thing is that our comprehensive plan right now has not been updated holistically since 2000. There have been bits and pieces there that get updated over time as we do other master plans. But we do envision doing some work in the next few years to update that document. And so what's on the comprehensive plan map and what then is enabled and allowed by the development code really kind of all work together in that regard. So I think that we would look at how we can take these ideas and talk about them as we look at the city's policies more broadly. That way we're being sure that we're getting some good community feedback and being holistic about how we implement these. And so on one hand, they seem like discrete actions. On another hand, they do kind of interrelate to one another. And so I think we would, it's just important to note that we would look at them that way.
And I think that gives you a broader opportunity for community goal discussions to inform implementation of these actions. I'm going to skip on to item B unless anybody else has comments on item A. All right, so item B is really sort of an extension of what you've done as it relates to missing middle housing. So the city implemented missing middle housing in 2022, which means that you can build a wider range of housing types throughout Wilsonville. And this was implemented, in more detail in Frog Pond, east and south, where specific regulations require development of a diverse range of middle housing types to ensure a balance of housing types. So middle housing are things like cottage clusters, townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, in integrating those into neighborhoods where you also have single family housing as well. And so this action is about extending, integrating more of those housing requirements in targeted areas even further than you have, looking at whether there's any needs for incentive for development of manufactured, prefabricated, or modular housing. You could offer density bonuses or some other incentives to support development of these kind of housing types. And they're essentially housing types that can be very much like the type of, typical single family housing that you get. Some of these can also be multifamily housing types, like prefabricated housing, where the house is essentially built in pieces in a factory and assembled on site rather than being what you call stick built single family housing that's built on that site specifically. And the idea with that piece is that these types of housing construction types can be lower cost, so more affordable than necessarily more traditional stick-built housing. Not always, but it could be. And then continuing to allow for a mix of residential housing throughout residential zones. In a discussion we recently had with Maria from the Latino Network, we were talking about multi-generational housing and how some of these middle housing types offer opportunity for that, which of course can be important for different communities, different groups within the community. So are there any comments about or questions about this one? The implementation for this is very similar than the implementation for the last one. It's about looking at your standards in Frog Pond East and South and how they could be adapted to other places in the city, looking at other incentives or standards that can be used, and working with stakeholders and your planning commission to get input on some of the potential changes to your zoning code or other policies, and then having public hearings with the planning commission and city council. And just following up with what Carolyn was saying on schedule, those would be evaluated again in 2026 and with a council decision in 2027.
Given the fact that we have a limited availability of land, how does that impact our ability to meet A and B?
In the housing capacity analysis, given the forecast of housing that we saw for Wilsonville, you have enough land to accommodate most types of housing. The type of housing where it's more concerning is multifamily housing, and a lot of that would be expected to go into town center. So I would say A and B, I'm not too worried about those. A would increase the amount of land that you would have where you can build different housing types, and B would make it easier to build more housing types and perhaps less expensive housing types throughout the city. So I'm not worried about land for your single family and your middle housing types.
I know I've asked it before, and you know what I'm going to ask, but The fact that we have one of the highest per capita amount of rentals and
Mm.
also a significant number of multifamily housing already in place
Mhm.
can that be taken into consideration as we're developing this out on our HPS?
Well, I think it's taken in consideration in your in your HNCA, what you've got, and what you're required to look at. These housing types that we're talking about, either for A or B, they're not explicitly either rental or ownership. Item B can make ownership housing more attainable because we're talking about housing types that are less expensive potentially. They aren't necessarily going to be less expensive, but they can be less expensive. And so that may well offer more opportunities for more of the more affordable ownership units. Something
And
like a duplex could be, owner occupied in maybe on both sides because it's multi-generational, or owner occupied on one side and renter occupied on the other. Townhouses, again, are more likely to be owner occupied.
so is there, based upon our last meeting when Maria brought up wood burn, are we taking any of that into consideration from an ownership standpoint? And is that a requirement within this program? Do we have to be specific about that?
You don't have to be specific about that in this kind of case.
Okay, thank you.
So the tenure for this is either renter or owner. I think item B tilts a little more to owners than to renters. But it's not explicitly either.
Okay.
Are there any other comments or questions about this one? Okay. I'm only seeing a few people who are shaking their heads, but nobody else is screaming away. So I'm going to go on to item C. Item C is, I think, our geekiest action here. What this is about is the administrative process for processing through a development proposal. So the way you currently do it is applications go through a public process where you have a public hearing. That was important to have, especially before you had clear and objective standards in your development code. Now cities, including Wilsonville, are required that their development code have a pathway that's clear and objective rather than one that is more subjective. And so if it's clear and objective, then what you are proposing to develop, and you're proposing it under the clear and objective standards. So that's things like certain setbacks and lot coverage and building height, all of that. You currently still have a public hearing about that rather than allow administrative review. And the public hearing isn't serving the greatest purpose because if a developer is taking a clear and objective pathway, then they're doing something that city has said they can do outright. And so this would be looking at where you've got development proposals that are clear and objective, allowing that with an administrative review rather than a public hearing. Kim, am I saying that about the way you would you think about that?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think the one thing, a couple points I would make, there still is a pathway for project developers who are not meeting all the clear and objective standards of the code. We have what's called a waiver process, and so we would contemplate that would still go through a public hearing process. The other point I would make is that just because it's administrative review, there is still a public comment period associated with that. It's just not a hearing. So people still can provide comment, voice concerns. It's just there's often a bit of a rub when you get a public hearing and people are providing comments, and it's not something that really can be addressed because you have a development meeting clear and objective standards of the code. So the goal is to try to provide a little more timing certainty, which can help reduce costs to projects and get housing online more quickly.
And I think it also makes it a little bit clearer where people can have a meaningful input. I apologize for interrupting you.
How can you ensure to our citizens and our residents that their voice is being taken into consideration, and that the developer is not being put in a superior position to the community desires?
So I think the really important point there is that the community involvement becomes really important when it comes to developing the standards of the development code. So I'll use as an example Frog Pond East and South. The city recently adopted development code standards for that area. And so essentially it's cut and dried. If you're within these parameters, the city has said this is development that is approvable and consistent with plans. So there is still a place for community voice. It's just shifting it to the development of the standards to ensure that we're essentially enforcing those standards equitably across the city, and that we're not creating an environment. Sometimes what happens is people invest a lot of time and energy into providing testimony, and at the end of the day, the developer is following the clear and objective standards. And so they're not necessarily above the community. They're doing what the community has adopted. And it just creates, a bit of an awkward dynamic that's often hard to navigate, because essentially the developer is trying to do what the city has said is acceptable. And, people still oftentimes will want to push back against that, but the developer does have a right to follow the standards of the code. So it's balancing that. And I think, the bigger piece and the task we have as a city is making sure that there is good engagement and input as we're looking at items like item A, item B, item D, which really do impact the development code.
So here's my concern with that, and I will bring this up in front of council too, is that the state is telling us we have to do this. Is that
the housing production strategy?
Yes, the state is telling us we have to do this and we have to comply with it. The city is now saying to the citizens, you can have a voice, but it's really not going to make a difference because everything's all set in stone. When you have a public hearing, there can be an appeal process that, I'm concerned that it's minimizing the power of the public, and that that we're, and I'll say this as gracefully as I can, that we're doing the same thing to the citizens as the state is doing to us.
So Dan, I see that you popped up. I don't know if you want to take
Katie, this may be a better sidebar conversation with Miranda and I sometime. There's a long history here, and about these processes, not necessarily Wilsonville, but broader, being used to leverage and to tie things up unfairly, to delay housing, to do things for not the right reasons to stop housing. So there's a much more color to this than just what we're talking about here, and why the state is taking some of these actions. Happy to talk about that with you sometime.
I would note though that just for abundant transparency, that the administrative review process we're talking about here, because it still allows people to provide testimony and public comment, they still then would have standing and can appeal even an administrative decision. The DRB also can call up administrative decisions that can also then ultimately be appealed to council. So they're not cut out of the ability of having access to an appeal process.
Okay, Kim, that's very helpful. Thank you.
And so my viewpoint is, I think that this administrative review process is really, really important. Because I do have faith in our development code and I have faith in our staff. And the biggest complaints we hear is how long it takes to get permits and the delays of getting the start, the plan to be executed so that you have a place where people can live. And so I understand what Katie's saying, that being concerned about maybe neighbors that are living nearby, but we also have to look at the big picture for the city of Wilsonville, that we're accommodating the entire community. And so anyway, I'm really in favor of the administrative review.
And I think a lot of these details are things that we'll certainly talk through when we do examine this action. Since we do have this task force at our disposal, I would like to ask for anybody who might be on the other side of things in terms of the development process, if there's any feedback or input you have on this action that would help us as we consider this moving forward.
I mean, I can add just that I think that this is really great. Before this, I was with the city of La Pine, and public input, is goal one of the planning process in the state of Oregon. I think oftentimes you can see that kind of get twisted, and people use, I guess, comment periods to really, I guess, go after projects. And the most I've seen that working with cities has been affordable housing projects. So having this clear and objective standards to approve administratively, I think can really kind of help sometimes protect those housing projects that might otherwise get a lot of community pushback.
Kelly, I see your hand up.
Yeah, no, I just want to kind of support the city staff and what you said in your explanation. With clear and objective standards, and I'm with DLCD. I work with jurisdictions all over the metro region, and when we have clear and objective standards, I think a lot of folks will assume that at a public hearing, they can testify against something that they don't like and have an impact and influence that decision when if that project meets that clear and objective standard, really they can't really influence or have an impact on that. And so it almost sets up like a false sense of like how much influence they have, and so it can waste people's time and energy in that way, right? So because of what the legislature requires with clear and objective standards, I think this makes a lot of sense, and we see communities going in this direction all over the state.
I also think that Kim, this will underscore part of what you've been saying about the importance of public involvement in setting policies and goals, and so that sort of raises up the importance of your comprehensive plan work that you'll be doing.
Yeah, Beth, I appreciate you saying that, because I think that is the issue. I do take issue with that, it takes time and people don't feel they're heard. I believe that individuals do have a right to have a voice, even at least to speak up. And that's even understanding that may not change the outcome, but at least, and that's what that's what public comments are meant for at city council meetings. So as long as we make sure that and I know that we will, because we have a stellar staff in Wilsonville, that we will make sure that the citizens of our community are made aware as code is developed, and as all of these administrative rules and everything for development are built out, that there's a very transparent process. So I'm good with this, but I at least wanted to get that on the table, that we need to be crystal clear that where citizen input provides the greatest value. Does that make sense?
certainly to me, one of the outcomes of this is I'm going to suggest to Nicole that we add a little bit to the description about, you know, the fact that people will still be able to submit comments and then appeal.
Thank you.
Even with that.
That's
So,
actually, Beth, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
is there anything else? Any other comments on this action? Just pop over to the to this and just remind us that this will happen as part of this larger set of work. All right, then I'm going to take us on to action D, which is about accessible design. And so what this is looking at design standards for housing that providing incentives in your development code to encourage use of design standards in the housing that is physically and otherwise accessible to people with disabilities. So there are some standards that the city can look at, the city could use or model off of, like the Universal Design Standard or Lifelong Housing Certification. We're not necessarily advising that one is better than the other, just giving a few examples. You've implemented this already partially in Frog Pond East and South. So requiring a certain percentage of units be accessible or adaptable for people with limited mobility. So expanding on that idea. One of the things that I learned recently that I find really interesting and I guess disturbing is that a lot of units, and this is nationally, a lot of units that are accessible are not occupied by people with a disability. In other words, most people with disabilities don't live in units that are accessible. And so some of this is, of course, going to be a timing issue. If you have a disability, is there a unit that is available for rent that is accessible when you need it? Or if you're on the other side, you're trying to rent a unit and it has accessibility features, do you have an opportunity to rent it to somebody with a disability? This is a discussion that is sort of coming up statewide. And I think there'll probably be some interesting ideas that are coming out of the state Oregon Housing Needs Analysis discussion that the city may look at and go, hey, that's a good idea for item D, encouraging accessible design. So maybe it's not an idea that's on our list this moment. But you know, by the time you get to this in 2026, I think there'll be more of those ideas out there. And so again, the implementation steps are looking at changes to your development code or developing an incentive program to identify opportunities for increasing development of housing that is accessible. Working with your developers, your advocates, and your social service providers for people with disabilities, and your planning commission, making sure that you're understanding the different types of accessibility. For me, physical accessibility like ramps and low entry showers and that kind of thing, that always comes to mind. Of course, allowing service dogs or service animals. I always think service dogs. There are probably other types of accessibility that are important. Holding public hearings and city council to adopt your development code amendments. And then if you adopt your construction excise tax, you may look at using some of that funding, a portion of that funding, to offset some of the costs for this, or to minimize financial burden otherwise on low-income households, because developing things accessibly can, in some cases, be more expensive. So you want to keep that in mind. So those are all options that are on the table. Are there comments or concerns or questions about this?
I would love to be at the vanguard of this. I would love to be able to take the term encourage and lift it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's possible or if that even makes sense within this exercise, but encourage feels very fluffy and fluid.
You could require.
Require. I love the idea of taking it out of the developer's hands and putting it in the hands of making sure that for multifamily housing specifically, that
Mhm.
accessible design is a requirement within a certain number of units. And I don't know if we can do that within this exercise, but a developer is always looking to make money. And I would want to make sure that those individuals, particularly because we have an aging population, to
Mhm.
make sure that that is a specific requirement within multifamily housing.
I think those conversations are certainly on the table.
I'm interested in feedback from others.
Hi, I'm Gloria. I'm with the Housing Authority. I definitely I like the word encourage or incentivize. I think that affordable housing, as I'm sure we're all aware, is expensive and tricky, and the more hurdles, the harder it is to actually make it happen. But if there are incentives, then I think that it helps to really encourage it and encourage developers to look for a reason to make it happen instead of how can we, build just outside the city limits, or how can we, skirt this issue. So I don't know what incentives you've looked at or are considering, but I would encourage you to look into incentives rather than.
Gloria, do you have any incentives that you think are particularly effective?
I mean, yeah, let me look into it. Because maybe it would be something that if you have additional like ADA units, maybe there's a way that you could do it where it's not some kind of a tax break or something, so that it doesn't necessarily cost money, but it's kind of an exchange for something else, like less parking. That's not a great example, but something like that. So I'll ask around and I can send you some examples.
Okay.
Well, it kind of goes back to what are we trying to do here? Because our through this housing production strategy and everything that we're doing and everything that the state is asking us to do with the housing program, is it to make sure that those that are most vulnerable have the ability to have safe and affordable housing?
That is certainly one of the goals, yes.
Yep. And if I were to prioritize that among the goals, I would would that be one of the highest goals? Housing. Housing for
I
all?
think the HPS is the state statutes are administrative rules are pretty clear that it is one of the highest goals.
And that's when we go into making sure that those that are of greatest need and our most vulnerable populations have the housing that they require available to them. And that goes back to my concern about encourage, that I'm fine with leaving it for this.
Yeah.
But I think the devil's in the details on this, on what we do as a city on executing this.
I will certainly agree with you.
So Beth, it's like carrot and stick, right? I mean, yeah.
I mean, what you don't want to do is you don't want to have what Gloria was talking about. You don't want to have developers say, yeah, I'm not going to do that in Wilsonville because it's not possible for me to do it. It's not financially feasible. So it's, not pursuing perfection to where you can't get to good.
I get it. And they
yeah.
have to pencil it out so that their bankers can provide the funding. And yeah, I get it. They've got to have their ROI. Yeah, and yet I want to make sure that we're also filling the needs of the greater good.
So I noticed that Rachel had her hand up, but you put your hand down.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think some incentives, well, it's not totally related, SDC credits are usually pretty enticing to developers, so that could be a really good incentive. Typically we see SDC credits for if you do public improvements, so something surrounding building code might not be totally applicable. But that's, SDC credits and something I think is something that could be really incentivizing for developers.
Great. That's perfect. And I would expect that our really bright folks on our planning team already knew that. but I think it's something that we really have to pay attention to, Rachel. So I really appreciate your feedback.
I have a question. So we've talked about encouraging accessible design, but we've also talked a little bit about regulations. So should we put the word regulation in this item D?
So it could be encourage or require,
Mhm.
or encourage and require. We can embrace the and. That's certainly possible.
Because in my viewpoint, I think we need to add that.
The
What do you-
idea
What
of
do you think,
requiring
Kim?
the idea of requiring it is part of the description. It's just not in the title.
Yeah, I think that, because it's like a couple different things that are in there as parts of the action that we could do. I think there are some elements that look at requirements, like what we did in Frogtown East and South, but there might be other things that are incentives. I think we want to probably give ourselves the space as we explore this action to pursue one or both and whatever feels best. So I would say either the title is fine as it is, or you could do like an encourage and or require. Or I think the substance of what is described as part of the action is what is most important as to what we will look at.
So, yeah, so I think it would be important that the planning staff understands what the intent is behind it. And it sounds like you do.
So
And
I know that Carolyn, I really appreciate what you just said. And so given where both Carolyn and I are coming from on council, how do we make sure that doesn't get lost in the interpretation?
Well, part of the reason for writing it the way we have currently is so that, let us say that Kim is no longer involved in planning at the city, and she's got somebody else in that place, you know, when this is being implemented, and that Dan's not available. The impossible happens. The unthinkable happens. It's written here. You know, it says things like the city would provide incentives to increase units designed for different certifications. The Frog Pond East and South Master Plan include a strategy to require a certain percentage of units be adaptable. The city may want to build on those efforts. So I think we're making it clear that, you know, incentives and requirements could be in this. And in the implementation steps, it also says, you know, draft changes to the development code and or develop an incentive program.
So given what Council President Barry and I just said, Carolyn, would you be prepared to support this if it does not have the word require in it?
In the title.
In the title.
Well, it sounds like we have in the plan, there's going to be these titles, and then somewhere in the plan, there's the steps too. Is that right, Beth?
Yep, just like in the memo that you have from today. I'm gonna share my screen. Yep. Just like you have in this memo, this kind of description would be in it. And then you've got these kind of tables throughout that have the name.
Yeah, and that's where I think that this, you know, this discussion has to happen now, is because I saw the word would provide rather than will, and encourage versus require. There's significant differences in the definition of those terms. Carolyn, if you want to have it require accessible housing, I support you 250%.
Well, personally, I like it because I have a lot of friends that are either seniors or about to be seniors, and I know that they're looking for housing that's going to have accessible features, and there's lots of other people in the city or who may come to our city. I just think that this is a really valuable thing that we can offer our citizens. So I like the word regulate.
So I think maybe Beth, one suggestion I would have is just as we look through this description and city role, I think there's a place for maybe both incentives and requirements, because we might not want to require everything, but there might be things that we want to incentivize. On the other hand, there might be certain baseline elements that we do feel like having some kind of minimum requirement is important. And I feel like I'm hearing that. So it might be that it's a bit of both. And I think we just want to be clear in our description that, or clear enough that there is maybe, I think what I'm hearing is there's some expectation of some kind of requirement that we would develop as part of this. That's not to say that we might not look for some kind of incentive to do something else, maybe more, you know, because there's different levels of things you can do, right? And so like, it might be that there's a baseline requirement and maybe there's an incentive to do something that's more accessible. And I think we'd have to do more research to understand where to draw that line there through the implementation process. But I think what I'm hearing is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm hearing that some degree of some kind of requirement is important for this, and we should make sure that the description reflects that.
Agreed.
I love the idea that, you know, we could just encourage people, give them some incentives, but I don't know if that's always going to get us to the goals that we're trying to get to. But I like the emphasis on that, but maybe we need to have a little bit of backup regulation too.
Is there another term that we could use just besides encourage that could get us partially there?
Well, we could say incentivize
Incentivize.
and require.
I personally, I like that
I
because
do
it's
too.
clear.
Okay. Are there any other comments on this?
So I think you'd remove encourage, so it'd be incentivize and require.
Yep.
Yeah.
Ah, she's
Great
edited.
feedback, Carolyn. Thank you. Does anybody else on the task force have any concerns or any red flags that we should be aware of on that one?
Well, Eric has his hand up.
Yeah, I think it all really makes sense, right? You want to increase accessibility. I think the trade-offs, cost wise, just want to throw out like with Portland's RIP project, there's a lot of discussion about, additional FAR bonuses or like zoning bonuses that can help offset. So if you add cost to a unit, do you then get to add a unit for the project or something to that nature? So you can say you have to do this, but we'll give you this something anyway.
And I think that is the idea between the type of incentive that you might be talking about, Eric.
So maybe you flip it, it's require and incentivize. So we're saying we're requiring it, but we will incentivize you to do it.
Okay.
I'm interested in Rachel real quick. Rachel, any feedback on that since you're representing a developer?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to offer incentives that really kind of, we have a project right now in Bend where we're building a trail that wasn't necessarily needed, but it was SDC creditable, so we're doing it. I think incentives can make a lot of stuff worth it. Right now, SDC credits are the biggest one that pops to mind, but I'm happy to talk with my team about other credits. And we have Polished Commercial, who focuses on multifamily projects, which it seems like this is more geared towards accessible, if I'm understanding, kind of accessible design, accessible apartment units. So I can definitely loop them in too and see what kind of incentives they might find really worth it.
I think it's regardless of structure type.
I do too.
Yeah. I can definitely kind of circle back with my team, reach out to Polished Commercial as well, and send some of their thoughts too.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to move on to the next one. So this one is about preservation of existing affordable rental housing. And this is fairly narrowly focused. It's about affordable rental housing that is income restricted, where your tax credits, your low income housing tax credits, may be expiring in the next 5 to 10 years, where once those tax credits expire, then the owner of the housing has choices about what they do with it. Do they apply for new tax credits and say do some improvements to the housing with those and then continue as income restricted housing? Or do they convert the housing into market rate housing, where you lose that affordable housing from your community? So it's not about building new, it's about preserving existing. And the city's role here is working with state agencies and your nonprofit housing providers to identify at-risk properties, which is relatively easy because the state maintains a list of when housing tax credits will expire. And the do you say it Weideman Park?
Wiedemann.
Wiedemann. It's 58 unit structure of income restricted multifamily housing where the tax credits expire in 2029.
And we just approved extension of those credits last night.
Okay.
So the that would be the housing property tax exemption.
Yes, that's a property
yeah.
tax exemption, which is different. Are you telling me that's different than the tax credits?
Yeah, those are federal tax credits.
Okay.
It's convoluted, but
It
essentially
is.
we abate property taxes for several of the affordable nonprofit housing projects in the city. So that's one way that we provide ongoing subsidy. But these projects also, certain projects are funded through tax credits that essentially also help support ongoing affordability. And so we've been starting to see this a bit in the region where you have projects that utilize these tax credits, built about 30 years ago. And if there's no other mechanism in place to require long-term affordability, as Beth said, that there could be options then. And so
Oh gosh.
trying to understand and explore and establish relationships is what is key with this action.
So Kim, let's have an offline conversation with that, because what I hear you saying is that we can do everything that we are possible for us at the local level, but if the federal government suspends the tax credits, is this federal or state?
It is federal, but it's not the kind of tax credit you think it is.
Okay.
It's a very specialized tax credit. It's like a market for tax credits.
Okay.
And so in the last Trump administration, this was still a popular program. So,
Okay.
so it's not as, and frankly, if those tax credits went away, depending on what the state was doing, I don't know that the state would be able to, back that up in any way. They'd certainly be very concerned. But if those tax credits went away and you were unable to implement the action, the city would be able to report we can't implement the action because the fundamentals behind the action.
Thank you.
But it's good to be aware.
Yeah.
So, and with the political climate, so I heard what you said about the previous Trump administration. Do we have an idea or a feel of what it might be with the current administration if it's in jeopardy?
I have not heard any talk about this particular thing. It may well be that our representative from the Housing Authority, Gloria, has some insight that I may not have on this.
We feel pretty sure that it's going to stick around. It has bipartisan support because it's basically equity injected into a deal that you then sell to a bank who can use those tax credits on their taxes. So then instead of paying dollar for dollar taxes, they pay 90 cents on a dollar for their taxes. So both sides usually support this program, and it'll likely stick around. And the project that you're talking about now that expires in 2029, even if the program went away tomorrow, this would still be, that would still stay affordable until 2029. It's basically like there's a land use restriction on the land for 30 years.
Got
And then
it.
if it's not, yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. Are there any concerns about this action?
None from me.
No, but just hearing the different voices and opinions is really helpful. So I'm really glad everybody's taken their time to be here in this meeting.
And so this one starts, we've got the evaluation in 2026 with if there's, any council decision specifically to it, it may well be that, the council is just saying, continue to take this action. I'm not sure this one has a big council decision to it. But the idea that you'd probably want to start having the conversations some years before the tax credits expire. So.
Has the city looked into the revolving loan fund? I don't remember if we brought this up previously.
Which revolving loan fund?
The one that's $75 million that's relatively new that you can use property tax. You can basically like grant property tax money. That one.
We haven't looked into that specifically now.
Okay.
I am
I
aware.
mean, that could be.
Yeah, I remember you brought it up early on, and so that might just be something, if that's a potential avenue, to at least note that as a consideration for us when we look at implementing this, because this one feels like there's a lot of different paths that we could take, and it's really going to just depend knowing what tools and what's available to us at the time, and if it's more policy based or if it's more financially based. So we certainly would want to explore that.
Are there any other questions or comments on this one?
No, but Gloria, I appreciate your input on that. Are there any other tools or any other programs that we could potentially have access to through the Housing Authority that we're not taking into consideration as we're building this out?
I mean, there may be some programs through the county or some sort of funding that could be allocated through the county. I can talk to our economic development team about it and just see what they know.
That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Then I'm going to move us on to item F, which is really about building capacity for the city in terms of staff. This would be about developing the requirements for a housing specialist position. We're looking at, developing those requirements, and then presumably there would be some sort of council decision about the requirements and looking at eventually hiring somebody for that position. The housing specialist position is the position that really unlocks some of these other actions for consideration. So looking at expanding land disposition efforts, partnering with the Community Land Trust, supporting a home buyer assistance program, and implementing a rental rental housing inspection program. So that would be the staff who would be in charge of doing those kind of things. And of course, you'd need funding to support a number of those things. And some of that funding would come out of item G, construction excise tax. So sticking, I'm sorry?
I was gonna, before you go any further, Beth, go ahead and finish up.
I was gonna say, can we stick with item F first and then go into item G?
So Carolyn, given our council goals on Saturday, can you go over to the timeline, Beth?
Certainly.
I think the timeline is off.
Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I believe that this is a 2026, 2025 council decision because this is within our council goals now.
Kim, in terms of
Not sure.
implementation of that? I'm sorry, Councilor Berry.
Yeah, I'm not positive. I'd have to go back and double check.
Yeah,
But
I'd
I mean, I
say
trust Katie. She's super smart.
we are not yet at the point where the outcomes of that council goal setting have been kind of formalized and disseminated down to the staff level. There usually are some intermediate steps for that to get fully fleshed out and finalized. So that being said, I think we took an attempt at putting this together based on just understanding our work program and understanding kind of answering the funding question related to this piece. We do, I think, have the ability to, before we adopt this, we have the ability to take that into account. And so I think understanding when that might be happening, I think the council decision essentially would be the budget cycle, right? So you do your budgeting in the spring, the council decision on that would be related to that. So we'll just make sure that we align whatever came out of the council goal setting with the timeline here.
So
I don't know that there's any harm in getting something done sooner than we put on this timeline. Is that correct?
There is not.
Okay.
I just don't want the can kicked down the road.
Okay. Well, that's helpful information to know. So we'll make sure that once we get this finalized, that it's aligning with what is in that goal setting.
Okay, that's all I ask.
And I think reasonably is the important thing, because particularly with this type of thing, we want to be sure that we're poised and ready to go when we've, allocated budget to that. And so if there is a desire to have it in place sooner, that's great. We just want to make sure that we're realistic about what we're holding ourselves to. So.
Well, my concern is that if you're talking 2029, 2028 and 29, I'm sure not going to be here.
Never
And
say never.
we'll talk offline. So I want to make absolutely sure that it doesn't get lost. Would you be comfortable, Kim, if we at least moved it into 2028 so we had evaluate starting in 2026 and 2027 so it matched item E?
I think that makes sense. And then
Because it feels like an outlier right now. So if we can move it over so it, at least for the moment, it mirrors E. I'd like to see it mirror A, but for now, if we can just have it so it mirrors E.
So we will do that. Are there any other comments or concerns or questions about this action? Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of getting into the nitty-gritty, and I know that we've talked a bit about especially incentivizing the accessible design. So just thinking about from the developer's perspective, working in lots of different jurisdictions, it can be hard to track all those incentives. So it'd be really great to have this housing specialist position looped in on attending pre-application meetings. I mean, I worry about all the work that they're going to have. And I'm sure they will have a lot to do. But having them kind of looped in early on the land use.
So that is one of the items. Create, maintain, well, it's sort of one of the items, and maybe it isn't. I apologize. Online one-stop shop, which is not what you're talking about. I apologize. Please continue.
Oh, no. I think, yeah, just I know they're going to be really busy and have a lot to work on, but maybe including them on notice of applications, kind of on that noticing list, and seeing if they can at least be looped into pre-application meetings might be really helpful.
And Rachel, a question for you. Many of our sister cities already have a specialist in position, correct? Is that pretty much the standard?
I don't believe in a pre-application meeting I have sat in with someone in a housing specialist position, but it would be very helpful.
And I think there's a little bit of discussion that probably needs to happen with what is the role of this housing
Right.
specialist versus what is the role of other planning staff?
Right.
It may be that other planning staff are the right people to have, and they have more time because they've given up some of their things that are more housing specialist type
Mhm.
actions.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, just I think, yeah, whether it's planning staff or this position, just maybe kind of looping them in early on to make sure that those requirements are being hit could be really helpful.
I think maybe just, I think that's important to acknowledge in the, just part of the implementation is that we would be looking, part of what their task would be as we build out a position description is being a participant in the development review process, which would include those steps, so.
And so I think we just add that to the section that says the city envisions that a housing specialist would, and then there's a number of bullet points. And we add a bullet point there. Are there other comments or questions on this one?
No.
Okay, so then going on to the last action, which is establishing a construction excise tax. And there's you know, a formal process for this and formal requirements for it, which we've included some in the description. That process, where I've heard of it being more successful, has been engaging, you know, closely with your development community, to understand, you know, what is more acceptable with the development community. A CET requires that there's certain incentives that some of the CET is used for. So things like tax abatements or fee or SDC waivers, other types of incentives. So you want to align your incentives with what else you're doing with the SDCs, the rate you're charging, not SDCs, CET, the rate you're charging, that kind of thing. So involving your stakeholders in that discussion is a really critical part of that. And we've got the CET on board for doing that work in 2027 with a council decision by the end of 2028. So I invite any comments or questions. Rachel, I see your hand.
Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but don't want to hog the mic. But I guess I had a question, and I know you're looking for developers to speak to this. I'm probably not the best one on our team to talk about this, but I'm happy if you want more input, someone more on our construction team if you want to talk with them. Is this construction excise tax, is it going to be like, when is that payment going to be required? Is it going to be looped building permits? Because with Polish, we kind of do master plan development. So we're also doing the horizontal construction. So construction of like streets, utilities, all of that. Is this CET going to be on roadways and that construction as well? Or is it just going to be on vertical construction?
I can answer some of the questions. One of those questions I've never been asked. So a CET can be up to 1% of the permit value for housing. You generally accept, you know, give an exception to your income restricted affordable housing. They're not usually required to pay the CET. It doesn't have to be a full percent. I think Bend started with 1/3% or 0.3%. You can also have a CET on your commercial and your industrial development. I don't believe it's on your public improvements like your roads, that kind of thing. And there are specific ways that you can spend, that you are allowed to spend the residential construction portion of the CET. So things like developer incentives, a little bit for administrative costs, and then for other flexible, you know, affordable housing programs defined by the jurisdiction. a little bit of the funds, 15% of the funds flow back to Oregon Housing and Community Services for homeowner programs that are supposed to flow back to the community as well. So when is it imposed? I've never actually been asked that question. So I would have to find out, unless Kim or Dan happen to know that answer.
I just Googled it.
Oh, you did? All right.
Yeah, because I wanted to make sure I was understanding what a construction excise tax is. And, you know, just the general Google response said that it's a tax imposed on when a building permit is taken out.
I think we'd want to verify that if it has to be. There may
Yeah,
be
so,
some
yeah,
flex.
so for, you know, just that general search, affordable housing, CET, some cities like Portland also have an affordable housing construction excise tax, which is a separate tax that can be levied on building permits with a value of more than $100,000.
And so we're getting into the details of different types of CETs, and when different cities implement them. So, and they're going to be different by different cities. So how about we go back to our colleagues and see if there's flexibility on the when.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Are there other questions or concerns?
I mean, when you say establish a construction excise tax, to me, that means that the staff is going to, you know, define what it is and do an inventory of what we do and maybe get examples what nearby jurisdictions are, and then, you know, bring it to, let's say, the city council to make a decision.
That's approximately it, including engaging with your developers and your business community to understand tolerance for the CET, and then seeking direction.
So,
Council.
Beth, Carolyn, I'm really glad you're digging into this a little bit. So, establish feels like more of a directive. As opposed to what we used with encourage, evaluate, terms like that. Why are we establishing such a clear directive on the CET as opposed to evaluate or encourage?
Well, I mean, in all honesty, the state is clear that we should be using more of these specific terms. So the city is committing to trying to establish a CET. It may be that in looking at the CET, the city finds that this isn't an acceptable policy, and the city decides to do some other action instead of the CET. So some of the softer language is a little problematic, honestly. So we're trying to be very clear about what the city is saying it will do. So in other HPSs, cities have said, you know, evaluate this program, you know, evaluate implementing this program, and, you know, claimed potentially they evaluated implementing the program. They did what they said they were going to do in the HPS, even though they didn't actually adopt it. So, you know, so they did what they said. And so, you know, establishing a CET, you may not be able to establish it, and you may choose to do something different in the end.
And then why wouldn't we change it to evaluate?
Because I think that that's probably going to cause you some concerns in the state review of this, and require that you're clear about what your specific action is. We've been trying to be clearer about what each of the actions are specifically, so you can measure, did you do that? And you know, evaluating it doesn't necessarily have a meaningful impact on this. Kelly, I see your hand up, and I welcome your response.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. Yeah, I think the word establish is certainly stronger, and it indicates that the city does plan to actually do this. Evaluate would leave open a question of like, well, what happens after that evaluation, like Beth said. And then it's hard for DLCD in our review to to really say that yes, there will be a positive impact from this, because if it's just an evaluation and we don't really know what the outcome will be. I will add that and I apologize if this was already stated, but if future city council does take this up and decide ultimately to not adopt a CET, that's okay. This that could be replaced. This action can be replaced with something else, or the city could kind of make the case that it's something that isn't like that the city's still doing enough, right, to provide resources and support for housing production. And so, there would have to be maybe some sort of explanation, evaluation, or replacement action at the time. But there's, it's not like you can't change later on if circumstances change.
So Kelly, are you comfortable with the softer language that we're using in some of the other actions? Evaluate, facilitate, support.
We've gotten rid of encourage.
Right.
Got evaluate use of administrative review processes for item C, and facilitate. And yep. Just going back.
I think I think that it's perfectly fine to include some softer words for actions that really the city isn't willing to make a harder commitment to. I think that the result is that when DLCD is kind of reviewing the city's HPS, that maybe we don't, like, the staff and the housing team won't be able to really, I guess, give you credit for that as much as something that's a little more committal in nature. And so, but also I think it really matters. And I think Beth alluded to this, is that the implementation steps underneath the title of the action are really what's being looked at, is like, what are the actual implementation steps? And if those are more solid and like action oriented, and it includes some commitments, then having some softer words in the title doesn't really matter, I guess, as much.
Great, because I would like to be able to have a higher level of comfort that when we do put this in front of the DLCD, that we're like, it's not going to get kicked back to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have to say, I am not part of the review team. I'm not on the housing team, but I'm kind of parroting what I hear from them as they're reviewing. And so, if you want to follow up, if you all want to follow up with, Samuel, who's on the call, or Mari Valencia Aguilar, who couldn't make it today, but will be part of the review of the document, of the final plan, then, please do reach out to us.
Great feedback. So Kim and Dan, is it possible that we can, before this goes in front of council, that we can test this in front of the evaluation team?
So we did have a meeting about a few weeks ago, month ago, like time flies fast. We did not get very clear feedback at the time. We were told that these actions would be reviewed once we adopted the HPS. And so I think if there is an opportunity that we can get a little more solid feedback on that, that would be something we would welcome. But we have attempted to have that conversation already. That being said, I think in terms of like the actions and the words, at least my perception of this is that when you compare action G to something like action A, Action G is really focused on kind of one tool, right? And it's the tool, and the purpose of the tool is to raise money for our future affordable housing efforts or housing efforts in general. Something like Action A, I mean, I think what's tricky there is like when you use a more strong word instead of evaluate, you're really kind of getting out ahead of a whole land use process. And I think, at least from my point of view, this is just me speaking as a planner who would work on the land use process. I mean, I think that really, really kind of presupposes an outcome from something that it should be more community driven and, you know, working with stakeholders and engagement. It's a lot more complex to look at land and have that conversation with the community. And so I think there's a couple different options under Action A. I feel like a softer title is more appropriate there because I would be really hesitant to presuppose the outcome of a land use process. I mean, that just doesn't feel like how we should be doing planning. But I think something like Action G is a little different because it really is talking about a specific tool and evaluation of that tool.
Excellent feedback. Thank you.
I do, and I do see that Samuel has his hand raised. I do want to circle back on the question about the payment timeline. I was able to go into ORS, and it's ORS 320.189, just for anybody who likes to read statute. But it does say that construction taxes are paid by the person undertaking the construction at the time that the permit is issued. So that would be building permit issuance, which is, I think, what I assumed the answer was, but.
Makes sense. Thank you for looking that up, Kim.
Yeah, of course.
Samuel.
Yeah, I thank you. I do want to you know, say that in an ideal world, the housing team would be large enough that we could be through this process from beginning to end with every single city. Unfortunately, it's a very small team, and you know, we are in active review of 5 different HPSs that have already been adopted. So you know, that's just kind of the constraint that we're under, unfortunately. I want to just echo a lot of what Kelly said. You know, ideally, a strong commitment language in the title, it certainly makes it easier for us to evaluate. However, if in the implementation actions it's clear that there is a discrete action here with a point in time that we can point to and say, you have done this or this has not been done at the you know, when this HPS said that it was going to be, like, we need something to you know, evaluate these actions based off of. So yeah, I would say that you know, like Kelly said, in the implementation steps, especially for A and B, it did seem like there were more clear, there was a clear endpoint to the work that we could look at and say, okay, this has been done or this has not yet been done.
So I'm going to share just a little bit here on the screen. I would say that seek input on direction of whether to proceed with the adoption from the City Council. That seems to be that kind of clear point to me. Samuel, you may disagree. That may not be what you're looking for.
I mean, I would say that adoption is an endpoint. I mean, that's how we would know that something has been done or not. So yeah, I think that's at this point, that's what I can say.
Okay. So what I think I'm hearing is DLCD would perhaps prefer that it stayed evaluate, but may accept say that it stay what is the word establish, but it may be okay to change it to evaluate.
Yeah, and I'll just be clear for the context here that so far there has not been a single housing production strategy, even among ones that we would say objectively are very strong, that didn't have some conditions. You know, all of them have been in that approval with conditions track. And it's mostly just been for us to get a little bit more information on a particular, you know, how outcomes are being tracked or how things are being done. At this point, we have not kicked any back to a city.
And I saw Miranda had her hand up. I don't know if she put it down also.
I think I'll go ahead and just make one comment, which I think is what both of the counselors are struggling with, is that being able to be definitive at this point in time is very challenging because it is a decision that needs to go in front of the entire council for the entire council to weigh in on, and not just through the task force process. And that is when the program would be evaluated and when a CET would be determined one way or the other to be adopted or not adopted based on more information. When we're in a housing production strategy, you don't have the full information about every potential action going in front of the council for evaluation. And so I think it's this challenge of, we want to be definitive and we want to be aggressive and we want to have a financial resource to help support and fund the programs and actions we want to put in place to advance housing. But that public process needs to be honored, and the results coming out of that public process to be the best possible outcome. And so in Wilsonville, it might be CET, but it might be something else. And so I think, CET is the most obvious program and tool that's known, but there's a lot that needs to be considered. And so I think that's where there's this challenge and this push and pull between the state and the program and how they need to evaluate our progress on our HPS. But the HPS is the first step, can't promise things that have to go through a public process.
I would say this is the tension point with every single city I've worked with on an HPS. It's yes.
Miranda, you could not have said that better. And I think what Carolyn and I are trying to do here is we're trying to think ahead based upon what we're hearing from the community, what we anticipate some of the questions and the concerns of other counselors will be, and really trying to get ahead of that. So when this is presented to council, we can say, we support it. All of our questions were answered, and really make sure that we feel very comfortable that we're not going to get challenged and be in an indefensible position. And I think a term like establish a construction excise tax, and Carolyn, you speak for yourself, but I would have some difficulty defending that because it sounds like it's already done. Whereas if we can use a term like evaluate, but also then walk into the steps, knowing that that's what we want our outcome to be, establish sounds like we've already made the decision.
So it sounds like we've got the latitude to change that language.
It does.
So
It does.
So I'm kind of wondering, based on what I heard Miranda say, that I'm wondering if we should change it to establish a construction excise tax or other funding tool or something like that. Is that what you were saying, Miranda? Kind of, this is one way to fund it, but there could be other ways that Wilsonville would find more suitable.
I'm not an expert in all the tools, and I think it's quite possible that the construction excise tax is probably the most powerful based on what I know, but it also may not be what this community or this council decides they want to do. So we could provide that flexibility. It would just mean that the action item associated would need to do an evaluation of more than just the CET when that information is brought back to council.
We could also include in here in the description or perhaps in the implementation steps, of, if the city council finds that it is, does not want to proceed with the CET, identify an alternative funding source. Approximately, similar in some way, approximately equivalent-ish. I mean, those kind of things, those kind of choices, I think, are the choices that most cities in one or more of their HPS actions are going to face, where you find when you get to implementing that action that it's not quite the right thing, and perhaps you discover that there's something that would be more appropriate to do.
So what you're saying is we would establish a construction excise tax, explore it first and foremost, but if we believe that that is not the ideal funding strategy, then we would look at other alternatives. We would not be putting them all on the table at an equal playing field. This would be our priority, and everything else would be subordinate if the construction excise tax does not make sense. That's what I'm hearing this say.
It could say that. It could go the other direction, but I think that leaves you with potentially worse choices. It may well be that, by the time you get to looking at a CET, that there's some better option. And you just decide we're going to change our HPS. We're going to work with the state to change our HPS to do some other option. I guess the question is, how much do you want the city to explore something, explore the wide open set of choices, of which, Commissioner, I can tell you that there's not great other choices. As we've been looking at the funding options for many different cities. Other choices that are similar to this are things like a bond. A bond, of course, can be much larger than a CET. But part of what we'll have for you in the HPS document is a little evaluation of funding choices. And there's not a lot of funding sources out there at this point. It may well be that the legislature makes some change in the next few years that establishes some other potential funding source. But actually we did include it in the memorandum, looking at, funding options. These are the common funding options. I haven't really heard of many more of them that aren't on this list. And it includes some things that aren't currently legal, like if Oregon made a real estate transfer tax legal, that ends up being a very interesting funding source for paying for housing programs.
Beth, maybe I can throw out a couple of ideas, just because I don't want to belabor the point. I think based on the work we've done, I think we understand that especially for those future options, a funding source of some nature is important. Figuring out how to make that commitment. And so I would say that we either, kind of keep it as it is with the caveat that if this doesn't work, we'll evaluate other funding actions. Or I mean, we could potentially rename it with still having a early and primary focus on CET. I think we don't want to, to Miranda's point, we're not all experts in funding tools. However, I think we know enough to know that this probably is the most powerful one. So, it's probably the best starting point for us. But, I do see that it feels a little bit cart before the horse to say establish a CET without doing the work. So I think those are a couple of options for us to go with.
Whoops.
Councillor Dunwell, do you have any particular direction there?
I like what Councillor Berry offered. And it maybe establish a funding source, including exploration of a construction excise tax, something along that line. I know that that's a lot, but I'm hearing that we don't want to remove the CET And yet that I'm really struggling with that term establish. What we're really talking about is establishing a funding source.
Okay.
Carolyn, is that what I'm hearing you say too?
What we could say is establish a funding source such as construction excise tax.
And then broaden the action out to looking at optional funding, the options for funding sources. And then talk a little bit more specifically about CET.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'd like keeping the focus on a fund that we think would work, and not opening it up too wide, because when you open things up really wide, then you're going to have delays and you won't get the funding as fast.
Yeah, and so if you're placing construction excise tax in the actual action name, I think that puts it into a superior position already.
Okay. So establishing a funding source for supporting affordable housing development, such as a construction excise tax.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that too.
All right. So any other comments before I go on?
No.
And I do want to do.
I
a time check
apologize
back.
first. I apologize that we're taking so much time, but we're going to need to defend this in front of council.
Yeah.
And I would rather us be in the position of being able to 100% support this rather than this get laid at the feet of our phenomenal planning team.
Certainly. Kim, you were saying something?
Oh, I just wanted to do a time check because we are at 4:49. I do think we've gotten through the bulk of the material. We've looked at the timeline, we've looked at the actions. Just want to be sure if there's anything else we want to get into before we wrap up.
That's what I was going to ask, if anybody had other comments or wanted to talk about any of these actions that we've identified for a future housing program. So future housing program considerations.
And just to be clear, we don't have the same level of detail in the document for these. We are highlighting these actions because we have talked about them, but we're not going through the same level of detail of writing out the steps and what the city role is and timeline or anything like that.
Essentially what these are recommendations for further consideration at the appropriate time. And recommendations have no formal requirement to them. We're saying we talked about them, they seem like a good idea, but because of the staff and resource constraints, they were not included in the HPS for this 6-year period.
Could you humor me and move rental housing inspection program to the top, please?
You just want to see it going first?
Yeah.
Okay, we can reorder that. I personally can't, but Nicole can.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So,
Thanks, Nicole.
and we can, even more importantly in the document, order it to the top.
Yeah, it's kind of my baby.
No, we were talking about how very important that is today. Is there anything anybody wants to say about these different options? These different potential programs?
Can you just describe what the expand public land disposition efforts means?
So the city has done some of this with your existing development site that I really should learn to say. I always want to call it, I don't want to say the word. Kim, what is the name of the TOD site?
Vuela project.
Vuela. I think I've seen it written down, so it's trying to be English in my head, which it's not. So essentially, it's a version of that. So looking at publicly owned land, specifically, city publicly owned land, it also could be your partners who own land, identifying if there's surplus properties and partnering with developers to develop affordable housing on those lands. And so in other communities, for instance, the school district owned a 60-acre site that they just didn't know what to do with, but they were very concerned about housing for teachers. And so the city, worked with the school district some and the school district decided to make that surplus and engage the developer on developing housing on a portion of it, and we'll probably do that some more. So it could be
Okay.
completely city-led on city-owned land, or it could be with a partner who owns land that is surplus to need. 60
Okay,
acres is
yeah,
a
I remember talking about that. Would it make more sense to add public owned land there, or is public land just described? Is that
we could
sufficient?
say expand publicly disposition of publicly owned land. We could just reorder the name there.
I like that. What do you think, Katie?
Yeah, I like that too.
Okay. Are there other questions or comments? And if there aren't, it's okay. Like the end of a long committee process. Okay. Then I'm gonna stop sharing this, and I'm going to repeat what everybody else has said, which is thank you so much for your time. We will be taking this in front of the City Council and the Planning Commission once again, coming up here soon. I have to get the dates because I wasn't prepared with that in my head.
It's in April. So April 9th, Planning Commission work session on the draft documents, and then April
21.
21st, yes, for the draft documents as well. So essentially, we've been working on putting together the whole framework for the HPS. We'll refine these actions based on this feedback, and that will go into the draft documents. We will then take the Planning Commission and City Council comments from that with a plan to bring this forward for a Planning Commission public hearing for adoption in May, and then going to City Council in June. And then, from there, we will go to that timeline and start looking at how we go about implementing the actions. So I will be following up after this meeting with a meeting summary and link to the video. If any other questions or ideas based on this conversation come up, please do forward those to me. We will be working to finalize the draft. So we've got a week or two here that we can work on some edits into the document we have. From staff, I really appreciate your participation throughout this process. Certainly, I think we bring what we know of the Wilsonville community, but all of your technical expertise has really helped us to find the right actions and provide the right feedback for our decision makers. And so for that, we are greatly appreciative. With that, I will turn it back over to Councillor Dunwell to provide our concluding remarks.
First and foremost, thank you all for your time and all of your expertise. And Beth and Nicole and Dan, Miranda, and Kim, the amount of effort that you put together to build this, so that I believe, at least from my perspective, and I expect that I will that Councillor Berry shares my my thoughts, is this is something that we can support. And with the data, with the feedback, and defend as we move forward. So thank you all. Carolyn, I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, just, echo the same thing. I was really impressed with the different levels of expertise and your organization, and just having the opportunity to hear everybody's voice. I think we did put together a really good document, and I'm excited about it. And, it's a big topic, and Katie brings up all the time that, the state is mandating it, but we don't always have the funding for it. But I think we did a really good job. I'm excited. So I'm really grateful for everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye. Good night.
All right.
Bye.
Night.